Hello friends, and welcome to this confirmation instructional video. This is instructional video number 7. Today we are going to be reviewing Manna and Mercy, chapter 6, along with the scripture readings that I've assigned to you in the assignment. So just to review, at this point in the story, we have come to the place where the people are settled in the land after the exodus from Egypt. After the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, they've finally been led to the land where God has asked them to settle, where they can now begin to live what they have learned in the wilderness. So here is a map of how the land was divided up. As you remember, the land was treated like the manna. So the more populous tribes received larger portions of land, and the less populous tribes received a smaller portion of land, so that every single person had more or less the same allotment of land. So everything goes along pretty well. There is no king at this point. There are what the Bible calls judges, and so if there was a problem, if the people needed to be defended from some of their enemies, God would raise up a judge for a time, and the judge would lead the people in battle so that they could protect themselves. But then when the threat subsided, the judge just went back to being a normal person. So in this way, everything was kept very equal, and this worked pretty well for quite a long time. After a time, though, there were some people who wanted a king like the other nations around them. No other country seemed to work like this at the time. I guess the people maybe perceived that the other nations were more powerful or more glorious or had a higher stature, and so they asked God's prophet Samuel to choose a king for them. Well, Samuel went and talked this over with God, and God said to them, as you read in your assignment, "Oh, go ahead, tell them what a king will do for them. He'll take all their land, he'll, force them into labor, he'll make slaves, he'll take all their women as wives for himself. Yeah, go ahead, sure, they can have a king, tell them." So Samuel went and told them that he and God did not think that choosing a king was wise for the people, and that in fact it would undermine their whole vision to be a society of manna and mercy. Nevertheless, the people were insistent. So there were two factions, right? The people who wanted a king and who didn't want a king. Chapter 6 is, of course, called "We Want a King." You can see the word king is kind of smelly. There it is. All right. There were two factions of people, those who wanted a king and those who did not want a king. The people who wanted a king over here said, we need a king for protection. We need a king so that we can be like the other nations. I'm not sure why that's a good thing, but that's what they said. Everything would be okay because along with the people, the king would also be subject to living under God's law, and God's law is good, and the king will also follow God's law, just like any other subject, so everything will be fine. And so because the king would also live under God's law, the king could not oppress the people like kings of the other nations. On the other hand, there was a minority of people who said, we don't want a king, and Samuel was on this side, of course, as well as God. And they said the king would oppress the people. The king and his family and the elites would hoard all the wealth to themselves. Society would be divided into big deals and little deals, just like where? Pharaoh's Egypt. Eventually, the people who wanted a king were so persistent that God and Samuel eventually gave in and said, okay, we'll choose a king for you. So mostly this assignment has to do with the first 3 kings of Israel. The first king that God chooses is Saul, and in some ways he is a very typical king. He is a great warrior. He's tall, he's muscular, he's handsome, he looks like a king. However, things do not go very well for Saul. And he has quite a few problems being a king. As you read in your assignment, God regrets naming Saul king and says to Samuel, you're going to have to choose somebody else. So Samuel tells Saul that you are no longer able to be king. God is going to choose another king. The second king that is chosen by God is probably the most famous king of Israel that ever lived, certainly the most fondly remembered. The story of his choosing is quite famous. God says to Samuel, go to the sons of Jesse, because among them is the person that I will name to be king. So Samuel goes to Jesse and tells him the deal, and so Jesse parades out his sons before Samuel, and they're all big and handsome and strong, and every time one of these sons come out, God says to Samuel, no, that's not the one. Eventually, Samuel says to Jesse, well, don't you have any other sons? And Jesse says, well, there's the youngest out tending the sheep, but he's just a kid. And Samuel says, well, go get him. So he comes, he's a youth, he's quite handsome, and God says, this is the one. I look on the heart, not on the outward appearance. And so that youngest son is, of course, David, who looked after the sheep for the family. He played music, he sang and composed songs, and became the second king of Israel. Now, David eventually ruled for quite a long time. He extended the borders of Israel to their furthest extent ever. He is, as I said, remembered as the greatest king in Israel's history. And what is helpful, and what I always will try and remind you, is that David ruled around 1,000 years BC. So that's a helpful kind of way to orient yourself in history. David ruled at around 1,000 BC, 1,000 years before Jesus was born. David was a good king. David was not a perfect king. David did sin sometimes. Most famously when he chose a woman for his wife named Bathsheba. David was out on his palace roof one day, and he looked down, and there on the roof of a house below him, he saw Bathsheba bathing and became very enamored of Bathsheba and wanted her for his wife. Only problem was she was married. She was married to a man named Uriah, who was one of David's soldiers, and so in one of his poorest moments, David sent word to one of his generals to say, put Uriah at the very front of the line, of the line of battle. And the general said, okay. And of course, the front line of battle is the most dangerous place to be. Uriah was killed. Bathsheba was widowed. So then David was able to marry her. Now that is the kind of thing that kings can be tempted to do. And David did them and took full advantage of his position. Well, luckily, God also appoints prophets to keep the kings in line to the extent that they can. The prophet in David's time was named Nathan. And so one day, God said to Nathan, go see David. And here's what you're going to do. So Nathan went in to see David and said, David, there's a situation I need to tell you about. And David said, well, what is it? What's happened? And Nathan said, well, there was this very poor man who had a little sheep who he was very fond of, and that's all he had in the world was this one sheep, and he looked after it, and it was like family to him, and it was the dearest thing in the world to him. Well, a very rich man who had a herd of hundreds of sheep was having a friend over, and needed a lamb to slaughter for the feast. And so instead of taking one of his own sheep, he went and took the poor man's sheep, the poor man who had nothing, and took his one sheep away from him and slaughtered it for his guest. And David was livid. David was enraged. This is unjust, right? This is a terrible thing for somebody to do. And he lost his mind and said, "Bring me that man. I am going to bring him to justice." And then Nathan looked at him and said, You are the man. You are the one who has sinned. You took Uriah's wife away from him. You sent Uriah into battle and had him killed so that you could take Bathsheba, even though you have your pick of any person in the kingdom to be your wife. And at that moment, David had a strong sense of his own sinfulness and of his own guilt and how he should not have acted. And he threw himself before God and asked for God's mercy and forgiveness. So the thing that separated David is that, David is remembered as the greatest king, not because he was perfect. David sinned. David did things that he should not have done, just like the rest of us. But what separated David and made him truly the most well-remembered king in Israel's history is that when he sinned, David recognized it and asked for God's forgiveness. Well, time goes on, and when it comes time for David's reign is coming to an end, he's becoming old, he decides to appoint a king to succeed him. So you'll kind of notice now how things are changing, right? First, God and the prophet Samuel choose Saul. Second, God and the prophet Samuel choose David. Well, now David is appointing his own successor, and who does he appoint? His son. And the son he chooses is the son that he has with Bathsheba, Solomon. So you can see now how the beginnings of a family dynasty are being laid in Israel. They are becoming, in fact, more and more like the nations around them, where maybe not the best suited person becomes king or the person of God's choosing, but simply a person descended from the king, right? In the king's own family. David chooses for the third king of Israel his son Solomon. Now, Solomon had some things in his favor. Presumably Solomon was very wise. However, clearly that wisdom had limits. Under Solomon, the worst fears of Samuel and God came true. Turning from the man away, as you read about in your assignment, Solomon accumulated massive wealth for himself, for his family, for those elites he gathered around him. He imposed forced labor and very heavy taxes, while he himself lived in opulent wealth. He had, whatever it says, 300 wives and 700 concubines, women he could sleep with at his pleasure. He had a giant palace. He had an army at his disposal. He had piles of gold, silver, ivory, cedar, fine clothes. It says all this, right, in Manna and Mercy. Israel became divided to a people of big deals and little deals, of exploiters and of the exploited. And God wept because now, in very short order, Israel had become what it had left, which is Pharaoh's Egypt. So on page 22 of Manna and Mercy, you see this picture of what Israel becomes under Solomon, right? You have God at the top here. You have a very pyramid-shaped system with the king at the top, supported by the priesthood and the military. You have the royal family right below him, and the elites, his administrators, and other big deals below them. Then below them, ordinary citizens who pay heavy taxes, and below them, the very lowest of society, right? The poor, widows, orphans, and slaves. the big deals and the majority of people being little deals, which of course is identical to the place they wanted to leave in the beginning, which is Pharaoh's Egypt, right there. It's a sad day. It's such a sad day in Israel's history when Israel becomes the thing that it hates. And the quickness of it only takes 3 kings to do this. The quickness of it kind of mirrors the very beginning of the Bible, right? When God makes this beautiful creation, and within, a chapter and a half, things start to unravel very, very badly. It doesn't take long for things to unravel. Well, now what is God going to do? The story is beginning to get off the rails, and God's dream of a universal manna society is being threatened. What will happen? Well, you will just have to tune in to the next installment to find out. Thank you for reading this story with me so far. This is the basis of who we are. These are the stories that we remember, who make us who we are. They remind us, these stories, of who we are meant to be, but also what we are capable of at our best and at our worst. God is very gracious in giving us these stories. These people are not idealized. We have them here, warts and all. And that is very, very helpful as we continue to heed God's call to become God's people of manna sharing and mercy giving. I am so glad to be one of these people along with you. Thank you for being part of this community. Thank you for sharing your gifts in whatever way you can so that we too can be the people God dreams of us being. Be well. Until next time, I will see you then. Bye-bye.